Welcome, everybody. This is the Home Rule Forum, sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland and Case Western Reserve Siegal Lifelong Learning and Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer. And our corporate sponsor is First Interstate Limited. We have a lot of programs coming up. If you go out to the lobby, you can grab a flyer. Our next event is a forum on Ohio campaign finance laws and alternative models. So money in politics, which is a big issue. This will be at Cleveland State Marshall Law School next Thursday, the 26th. There's a flyer outside if you want to take a look at it. Tonight's forum, the moderator is Tom Beres, who up until recently was the longest tenured reporter with one single television station in Cleveland. He'd been at WKYC for more than 34 years, covering the impact of political decisions and office holders on Channel 3 News viewers' lives and livelihoods. He won 5 Emmys, 2 for investigative reporting, and is a member of the Cleveland Press Hall of Fame. Tom is a graduate of Northwestern University, getting both a bachelor's and master's degree in broadcast journalism. He was born in Ashtabula and is a graduate of Westlake High School, where he was recently inducted into the Westlake High School Hall of Fame. He's moderated numerous political debates for Ohio Senator, Cleveland Mayor, and other offices. And for 10 years, he hosted, there's Tom Suddes, he hosted a weekly political show Between the Lines on Sunday mornings before Meet the Press. He's very grateful to have covered the political arena in his hometown. Tom Beres.
All present and accounted for. Hi, Tom.
Yes, someone once said it's been a long, strange trip, but I got here okay, and thank you, everybody, for your patience.
All right, but timing is perfect. All right, so thank you all for showing up, first of all. When Mike asked me earlier this year would I be interested in moderating a forum on the subject of home rule, well, you know, I've retired from the day in, day out, daily deadline grind of the news cycle. As home rule, what, you know, it's something I don't have at my house. I mean, all of the significant financial and policy and purchase decisions, I'm overruled by a much higher power. But I know that's not what we're talking about tonight. So lame attempts at humor notwithstanding. Our goal tonight is to try and have a thoughtful and informative discussion about the mysteries and inconsistencies of the power of home rule in Ohio and what it means to cities and residents in Northeast Ohio. How many of you are here because you're concerned maybe that your hometown community is losing some power that it ought to have? Okay. How many of you are here because you think maybe your hometown community is maybe getting a little too ambitious and overreaching and overstepping and maybe getting into areas where it shouldn't have authority? All right, I see which way the wind is blowing here. Okay, so again, why is it that cities cannot have their own laws to control drilling for natural gas, or who can carry guns in their public parks, or can anybody carry guns in their public parks? But why is it they can't have those kind of rules but are allowed to have traffic cameras and to regulate deer population and trans fats? Well, the reason is home rule. The do's and don'ts and the cans and can'ts are determined by the law, which laws fit under the city's home rule powers to govern themselves, to make laws for safety and public health. As long as they can do that, again, as long as those laws do not conflict with general state laws. It's all provided for in the Constitution, but when it comes to home rule right now, the trend is that the state legislature and the courts are very active. They can giveth and they can taketh away, and that's what's happening now. A lot of cities are not feeling too good about this climate of Columbus knows best that seems to exist in the state. So our panel tonight has a variety of viewpoints and a ton of expertise. Ladies first, Barbara Langhenry is the City of Cleveland Law Director, has been for 6 years. She's been on the city's legal team for 27 years. And we all know the city under Mayor Frank Jackson has been very aggressive and in the vanguard of fighting legal battles, trying to preserve home rule with what could charitably be called mixed results. She has brought a wingman with her, Gary Singletary. He is the city's chief legal counsel, and he has been the guy in the trenches on many of these legal fights. Tom Suddes knows as much about the history and politics of state government as any working news person in Ohio. He has a must-read column every week in the Sunday Plain Dealer and Cleveland.com. He is on the editorial brain trust of Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer, and he is a journalism professor at Ohio University, hence the just came in from the long drive. Tom Bier, we have an abundance of Toms here tonight, built a long career at Cleveland State and the Levin College of Urban Affairs as an expert on how state and federal policies impact local government. He is the go-to guy locally for anything about housing trends and population shifts, and timing is everything. He has just published a new book that fits right into our topic tonight, an ebook, and he has some really grim predictions and things to think about, maybe if things don't change in this regard. Our cleanup hitter is Mayor Mike Summers. He has a long career of public service at Lakewood as mayor, council, and school board member, and he is one of the driving forces behind a new bipartisan group of Ohio mayors that are trying to have more influence preserving and protecting home rule and standing up to Republican lawmakers. I should also get on the record that we did try to recruit a Republican lawmaker voice to be on the panel to talk about their reasons for voting how they have, perhaps, to override some local laws. But we were unsuccessful in that regard, and I would just say it's not for lack of effort. Well, the push to home rule in Ohio began in the late 1800s and early 1990s. And here's where we go to Tom Suddes, our resident historian expert here on how home rule grew out of that environment, the role that Cleveland played, Newton D. Baker played in all of it, and maybe fast track us up to where we are today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. It's nice to be in this library again. When I lived in Cleveland, in this area, in Lakewood, actually, in 82 and 83, I think I spent half my life here in the library, which is always a wonderful library. And you may know that your librarian, whose name I've forgotten right now, that era, helped devise our great current library funding formula for Ohio, which gives us probably the best libraries of any state in the union. And it's a real blessing to everybody as a civic amenity. Home rule got started because for decades and decades and decades during the so-called Gilded Era, beginning after the Civil War, the legislature was in the habit of interfering directly in the affairs of Ohio cities and villages. And the reason was not so much that there was a lust for power, although it's always true in public office, because it was much easier to get votes in the legislature from legislators who were not in that particular city or village to vote against the interests of those cities and villages for such things as utility franchises and other measures. In fact, for a time, depending on the city, governors of the state had the power to intervene directly in city affairs like appointing police chiefs and so forth. One can only imagine how, if that were true in this era, that would play out. In 1912, after years and years and decades of litigation over how the state dealt with cities and villages, we had a convention to revise the state constitution. And Newton D. Baker, who was one of Tom Johnson's confidants and lieutenants and close friends, co-wrote the home rule language in the Ohio Constitution. One thing I had forgotten until I reviewed it earlier today was that among the reasons that Baker particularly believed in home rule, we see like Bob LaFollette in Wisconsin believed that, and Justice Brandeis, as these members of the bar would know, said that states should be the laboratories of democracy. They should experiment with new ways of governing and managing public resources. Baker thought the same should be true of Ohio's cities and villages. They were becoming more complex demographically, industrially, commercially, and politically. They were also at the mercy, frankly, the public utility corporations. The exact quote eludes me right now because in I rushed, I left my notes in the car, typical me. My students love me for that reason, I think, sometimes, because of the fact that Newton Baker said the biggest threat to municipal government in Ohio were the public service corporations, and he meant the utilities, the streetcar lines, and so forth, because of their control of the legislature. So the 1912 article in the Constitution gave cities, and these members of the bar can explain better than I, it's a very complicated area, a great deal of autonomy in governing the local affairs internally for the cities and villages. And that proceeded for a good while in the 20th century, I suspect because some of our mayors, like some of our governors, such as Frank Lausche, Mike DeSalle, and yes, James A. Rhodes had been big city mayors themselves, George Voinovich, been mayors themselves, and kind of understood the dynamics of how home rule could help a community tailor-make certain things for its own needs and requirements and its own demographic trends. But then again, the big lobbies found it, shall we say, more economical to lobby one legislative body in Columbus to have its way with cities and villages than it was to lobby 900 some cities and villages in the state, I believe. I think that's correct. Then go to 900 and some city councils and village councils to lobby on behalf of their particular interests. And so beginning, fundamentally, I keep a list of these in my computer, and again, it's not with me. Beginning around 2000, the legislature, well, there's another exception to that. The legislature began peeling away at the right of cities and villages to operate in certain realms of policy. An example would be the fact that even though Cleveland voters voted in favor of residency for city employees, the legislature overturned residency without a statewide law, which didn't require such thing. The legislature also, I would say, again, I'm using layperson's terms, the lawyers would use better terminology than I would say gutted the power of cities to do such things as regulate predatory lending, to guns, firearms, particularly handguns and so forth, to regulate cable television, rates and services, to regulate a number of other fields of endeavor as well, all told about 8 or 9 different fields, including particularly of interest to those interested in the ecology and environment, the power to regulate oil and gas extraction within their boundaries. And so you may not know this, but frankly, if someone wanted to drill a well on the property of his library and somehow the library consented to it, the decision to be made about whether it should go forward would be made in Columbus, not in Lakewood, not at County Council, but in Columbus by the Division of Oil and Gas and the Department of Natural Resources. I should mention that the scene was partly set earlier when the state passed in 1983 the collective bargaining law for public employees, which I think, in my own personal opinion, was a good law. I may be in the minority on that. City officials may differ on that. But in a series of decisions, which are commonly known as the Kettering case, the Rocky River case, and another case, cities would say, look, you're imposing on us requirements about labor contracts that could bust our budgets. So therefore, we should have more say-so over the way these laws are implemented. State Supreme Court said, no, these laws override your home rule powers, and partly because they have a separate part of the Constitution governing labor laws and safety laws and so forth, which need not detain us here. So consequently, you have that happening on the political realm. I would submit to you, and I can't document this like a PhD person would or something, that part of the reason is in 1966, when we went to a one-person, one-vote legislature, Cuyahoga County sent roughly 18 members to the Ohio House. 18 members out of 99. It now sends about 10 or 11 members to the Ohio House, still 99 seats. The same pattern obtains in most other urban areas except Cincinnati, Columbus, which is a special case in all kinds of ways that those words can be interpreted, because it's growing like crazy and because it's annexed everything within sight. Consequently, the political power that once protected cities and villages, that is to say people from big urban areas, has been diluted in the legislature. So when a special interest lobbyist says, this mayor shouldn't have this decision, we should have one law, everyone knows what the law is everywhere in Ohio. That's a persuasive speech to a legislature that is composed more and more of people from the outer suburbs and rural areas. So it's no skin off someone's nose if he or she, they're good people, some of them, are from Salina or Defiance or Lima, outside the cities in each case, I might add, and votes against Cleveland's special interest in home rule because, after all, they don't represent anybody in Cleveland, do they? And yet they've done this time and again. And I think it changes fundamentally the vision that Tom L. Johnson had, that Baker had, that the fathers, and they were all men then, I'm afraid I have to say, in 1912, the fathers of our current Constitution envisioned when they did the Home Rule Charter, a Home Rule part of the Constitution. That's what I say the general background. Does that get us where we want to go?
I think that gets us up to speed and paints a pretty good picture, a nice abridged movie. Thank you. All right, so Barbara and Gary, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the City of Cleveland scorecard. Again, the City of Cleveland has been in the forefront of trying to preserve and protect some of these rights with, maybe not the best outcomes as far as the city's wishes have been in many of them. So could you kind of recap the past cases and maybe talk a little bit about what you think the impact on the city has been of not keeping these powers?
Okay. And I want to first pick up on where Tom stopped, and just so that everyone understands what the Home Rule Amendment says. It says that municipalities shall have authority to exercise all powers of local self-government and to adopt and enforce within their limits such local police, sanitary, and other similar regulations as are not in conflict with general laws. And so those of us who work for municipalities and care about home rule, it's really important to us. There's two parts to this. One is we have all powers of local self-government so that we can decide what our government looks like, whether our mayor is chosen from the city council or our mayor is separately elected, how long terms will be, what the conditions of employment are, what kind of qualifications our elected officials may have. All of those things that define how we operate as a government are our powers of local self-government. And then we have police powers, which we all know are regulations when we regulate the behavior of citizens or we license what they do. We have all powers that are not in conflict with state laws. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be in conflict with state laws as we go through some of the cases, because it's probably more instructive. But for those of us who care about municipal law, we think it's really important that the Constitution granted municipalities authority to work. We aren't preempted, and we don't use the word preempted because the constitutionally granted rights, we believe, are impervious, or we used to believe are impervious to what the state legislature can do, because they gave to us this right to govern ourselves and this right to make police regulations that don't conflict with the regulations of the state. But that landscape has changed, and just this year, the Ohio Supreme Court decided a case actually in favor of municipalities on saying that the red light camera law that the state had passed wasn't good anymore. But there were two sentences in this opinion that, to me, showed how far we've come. The court said that under its precedent, so long as a statute serves an overriding state interest with respect to police, sanitary, or similar regulations, then the third prong of the Canton test is satisfied, even if the statute limits the legislative authority of municipalities. And what that means is we used to believe that if we passed a police regulation, if it didn't conflict with the state's laws, then we were okay. And when you analyze whether it conflicted with the state laws, the state law had to be part of a comprehensive scheme to regulate. It had to apply to all parts of the state, and it had to actually set forth regulations. It couldn't just purport to limit the power of municipalities. In addition to that, it had to preserve a rule upon the citizens generally. So what that means is the state legislature couldn't say, cities, you can't regulate trans fats. And so we would say that would fail this part of the test, because that's not a regulation that governs how people behave or how a corporation in our city behaves. That's just flat out telling us we can't regulate. And we believe the Constitution gives us the right to regulate. But how far we've come, because if you look at some of the cases where we've lost, and Tom mentioned the American Financial Services case, which is where the city regulated predatory lending. And we had carefully crafted this law so that we did not conflict with what the state had regulated. The state was regulating in this area. And ours went a little bit further, and there was case law to support that when the state sets minimums on things, we can make it a little bit tougher, and that's not a conflict. But when the court decided the American Financial Services case against the city of Cleveland, it pointed to a portion of the law where the state had says the state solely shall regulate the business of originating, granting, and servicing loans. So the state said that first off. And when the court made that decision, the court said, well, the legislature expressed its intent to regulate all of it, and even though the regulations it has leave some holes, we think it's a conflict because they express this intent to regulate the whole bundle. And that was really the beginning for me in my municipal career of looking at how the Ohio Supreme Court was starting to chip away at our powers, because that had never been the case before. We had to actually see it, we'd line up our police regulations and see where there were conflicts. Here they were saying, if the legislature says that there's a statewide intent or it intends to regulate in this area, then that holds sway with what happens. We went from there to the residency case that Tom mentioned. And what's interesting about the residency case, we saw that as a matter of local self-government. And to us, matters of local self-government are sacrosanct. That's our power, and we have the right to determine how we work. And we saw this requirement that employees live within the city as a condition of employment that we had the right to regulate. And the state said, no, you can't. The state just flat out said you can't tell people where they can live. And they pointed to another constitutional provision. And it's a constitutional provision that says that the state can pass laws for the health, safety, and welfare of employees, and no other provision of the Constitution shall impair that power. And so what they said is allowing people, employees, to live wherever they want is for their health, safety, and welfare. And thus, because this provision trumps any other provision in the Constitution, cities, you can't do that. We, of course, argued vigorously that it was a condition of employment, and for us, it was a little repugnant to say that it was contrary to the employees of the city of Cleveland's health, safety, and welfare to have to live within the boundaries of the city of Cleveland.
How long had that law been on the books before it wound up in court?
The residency law had been around since, I think, '82 was when it was passed. It was in the early '80s under, I think, Voinovich was mayor. And then the state passed that 9.481 in, 2006 maybe?
2006. I thought it was 1981, but I'm not sure.
No, 1981 for the residency law for
I'm sorry,
Cleveland.
yeah.
But when the state passed its law saying that you can't determine where someone shall live.
That's right about when I started.
Yeah, actually, I think I have it here. Well, I don't know when it was. I don't know when it was. I'm sorry. '06. It was '06. In '06. And then the Supreme Court decided that case in '09, the residency case. And then we've tried to regulate guns. And again, this is a police regulation because you're regulating behavior. And in Cleveland, we look at it and we say there's a big difference between carrying a gun in a crowded urban park and carrying a gun in a rural area of our state. And it's much scarier to people if someone's carrying a gun in a crowded urban park. And Gary can talk about those cases. He's been intimately involved in our many gun litigations.
Well, I started with the city of Cleveland in 2005. I was a Lakewood resident from '86 to 2005, and as a litigator, I came to the city in that role. And the irony of ironies, I guess, if that's the right word for it, is when I started with the city in 2005, as Barbara indicated, they passed the residency law in 2006. I thought it sounded pretty interesting to want to be involved in learning home rule because as a civil litigator, I had not been involved in many home rule kind of issues. Sovereign immunity, yes, which is a whole different issue than home rule, but not actually the home rule. So I talked to Barbara, and I talked to Rick Horvath and Bob Triazzi, who was the director at the time, and they said, all right, we'll look at home rule. Let us see if you know what you're talking about. And so I started reading the cases, and as I'm sure Tom would recognize, that over the years from 1912, when the Constitution came into effect, there's been not residency, but home rule decisions that are all over the map. I mean, any side on any issue can pick an older decision that would support your position for the most part. And so residency was the first, and as Barbara indicated, we took it as a home rule case. The Supreme Court, we won in the 8th District, so our record's not totally bad. We usually do all right, at least through the appellate courts. It's the Supreme Court where we've had some issues with regards to them agreeing to where we think the law really is. So in that regard, residency, as Barbara indicated, they said this isn't a home rule issue, this is a 234 issue. And that's the law or the constitutional amendment that allows for the General Assembly to make laws for the welfare of employees that overrides just about any other law. The firearm case, that was, and it wasn't Cleveland actually that lost residency, it was Lima versus Ohio. Even though we did file an amicus, which means a friend of the court brief, and we were allowed to actually oral argue with Lima on that case, which was sort of fun. It was really I think the first time I had actually been in front of the Supreme Court on an oral argument. But the firearm case, that's probably the most disappointing case I've been involved with, and I'll tell you why, is because where the law comes into play on this thing is using the American Financial Services model that Barbara talked about. The General Assembly has learned a lesson that the courts will look at laws as a comprehensive set of laws. And in the firearm case, what the General Assembly did was pass a statute called 9.68, which said basically everyone has the right to carry a firearm, and you can't, there's no regulation with regards to transportation, owning, selling, things along those lines. And 968 was addressed that local laws could not conflict with state laws, and there was even a provision put in the law that said anyone who challenges a local law for being in conflict with the state firearm laws, that person's going to get their attorney's fees paid. Now, from the city's point of view, that's a pretty big deal, because lawyers, when they take these cases, especially civil rights cases or cases like the firearms case, where they actually challenge you and you lose, well, if you have to pay their fees, that gets, some lawyer fees are pretty fantastic, so then you get involved in trying to fight what's reasonable or not. But in any event, what we did, and the way we challenge state laws, is we file what's called a declaratory judgment action. And what that declaratory judgment action means is we go to the courts and we ask the court to decide whether a state law is actually constitutional or not, or whether they've invaded our home rule. And home rule, as Barbara indicated, as it's developed over the years, it's bifurcated into two basic clauses. One is local self-government, and the courts have said if something affects local self-government, basically the state is hands-off, because that is our authority under the law. And that's why in the residency case, they had to get out of a home rule analysis, because otherwise, who your employees are, the payment thing is not quite totally out of local home rule, but there are elements of it, as Tom indicated, with the Rocky River cases that sort of changed the totality of what was going to be considered under local self-government principles. But so we filed a deck action on the firearms law saying, look, Ohio doesn't have comprehensive firearm laws. It might have comprehensive concealed carry laws, but that's not the universe of firearm laws. So we filed a declaratory judgment action and challenged, saying, look, 968 is unconstitutional because it tries to restrict our authority to have effective gun laws for our urban environment. And really, what you have to look at, even before we went and made that decision, was back in 1993, there was a case called Arnold versus the city of Cleveland, where a citizen had challenged the city's ban on assault weapons and the whole idea of whether one could carry a firearm or not under the Second Amendment, and Ohio law. Actually, it was more the Ohio Amendment to the Constitution. And the Supreme Court ruled in the city's favor, saying that not only does the city have a right to regulate firearms, but it's a mandate on the city to pass police laws to protect its citizens. So we thought, going into the challenge to 968, we had a pretty good basis for the challenge. And just for quickly, right on the same day that 968 was adopted, the state legislature, or I'm sorry, When 968 was adopted, a Supreme Court case called Cincinnati versus Baskin came out. And in that case, the Supreme Court upheld Cincinnati's laws with regards to what constituted an automatic weapon based on the size of the magazine that a particular firearm carried. And in that decision, it's a concurring decision, not in the main decision, but the now Chief Justice talked about how Ohio's laws were not, she didn't view them as totally comprehensive. And so we thought, all right, we're going to challenge the law. We did that, and what the court came back, we won in the 8th District. They agreed with us that 968 wasn't a general law, but the Supreme Court said, in effect, that no, just like they did in the American Financial Services case, we're going to look at all of Ohio's gun laws. We think that's a comprehensive set of laws. It might not be as much as the state next door. It might not be as much as this state or that state. But for purposes of 968, we're going to say that the laws are comprehensive. And here's the key to reading, like 968 is not a firearm statute. It's not in the criminal law section of the statutes dealing with firearm laws for the most part. It's in a general section of the law where they throw a lot of hodgepodge kind of legislative things that, like 1.63 in the financial case, that was the prohibition on us doing financial, the predatory lending. 968, very similar, put a restriction on us. And what the Supreme Court said was the 8th District Court of Appeals, and our argument was wrong because you had to read the firearm laws as being comprehensive in nature. And so you had to read 968, not on its own like the 8th District did, but as part of this seam of comprehensive laws. And so the Ohio Supreme Court overturned the 8th District and did away with our gun laws. Before I stop, I'll just real quickly say that there's a current firearm case going on right now that the city has. What the city did was, in looking at how the Supreme Court had ruled, our city council enacted some firearm ordinances with the intention of looking at laws that were not regulated by 968 outside of that scope, like discharge is not regulated by 968. We passed parallel laws that we intended to be the same as the state laws in a lot of cases, but that were on the city books because then the city's enforcing its laws, and there's an advantage to that. So we were challenged almost immediately by Ohioans for concealed carry, who said that we didn't have the authority subsequent to the Supreme Court's decision in the Cleveland case to enact any laws, whether they were the same as the state or not. Well, we sort of a mixed bag from the trial court into the 8th District. The court agreed with us that we had the authority to enact laws that weren't differing from the state's laws, but then they found some of our laws, we believe, incorrectly because they found, like discharge. We had a law about it, I think it's a drunken person discharging a firearm or something, and somehow they read into that would be covered by 968. We don't believe it to be true, but so we've appealed the case. The 8th District, it was a mixed decision, and we've asked for the Supreme Court to accept that appeal. And I'm not handling that. Maybe Barbara thought, given the first case, I wasn't the person to handle that. But so, in any event, that case is pending before the court, and we should get a decision sometime in the next few months, I would guess, and the decision we're waiting on is whether the Supreme Court will take it. Because one thing to keep in mind is the Supreme Court takes very few civil cases, and the civil cases they do take are usually on constitutional issues, but you're not guaranteed in getting in, so you have maybe a 1 in 9, 1 in 10 chance of actually getting to the Supreme Court. I won't bore you, I've got another case I'm trying to get in right now, which I keep reading the list every week when they put out what they're accepting or not. So those are two main cases. I think I've taken enough of that time.
So just one more point. How do you respond to the gun lobby's very simplistic hey, you can't require, it's unreasonable to require gun owners and people that have CCW permits to be familiar with a patchwork of, umpteen or hundreds of different laws all over the state. And, that's, I think, the basis, at least logically, for a lot of what their opposition is. I mean, how do you rebut that?
Well, part of the rebuttal we had to it was the fact that that seems to be a new slogan that the state throws in every argument we have now, which is, tow trucks, microcell, which is one that's going on now, firearms. What the state argues is, we can't have this patchwork of local regulations. Well, what is home rule if it's not local regulation? And the key to home rule is that you can't be in conflict with a general law. We had numerous laws on our books that were not in conflict with the state's firearm laws. The only law that we were in conflict with was the law that said you can't have any laws because the state is setting up the laws and they're going to be comprehensive. So I understand that argument, but as far as transportation, there's federal laws that allow you to transport firearms from point A to point B, which we don't override at all. If you're a responsible gun owner, I think you should be aware of what local laws are. And if you carry a firearm into a city, you should be aware of what their laws are, because we had areas, public areas as we call them in our ordinances, which prevented someone from carrying a rifle or strapping on a gun and walking into these areas where people congregate. And the state doesn't really have a law unless you're a concealed carry permit holder that disagrees with our law there. But also, real quick, there's an unwritten kind of law, which is open carry. And during the RNC, you may have seen or may not, we were downtown with the city, and there were people carrying sidearms on their hips. We had people carrying AR-15s. And these aren't police or anything. These are just people who came into our city, and they were doing it for show and effect. And so you have a quite large audience. You had some fairly extreme sides on both sides of the president's nomination. And so there was a volatile mix that we were on pins and needles on throughout the week that the convention was going on. And we had discussions beforehand about, is there a way that you could control firearms during the convention time? But the state law prevails, and the state law is what was in effect. And the state law did allow open, not above board. I mean, there's no law that says you can open carry anywhere you want, but reading into 968 and the Constitution, it's been found that, open carry is fine. And there are certain restrictions, but that's based on concealed carry also, whether you can carry into a place or not. So I would say that responsible gun owners should know where you're carrying. Like Barbara mentioned earlier, urban and rural are two different areas. And if an urban gun packer wants to come into Cleveland or Lakewood or anywhere else, they should be aware of what those laws are. We're not taking your firearm away from you. We were just trying to regulate for purposes of safety within the urban environment that we're charged with protecting.
Barbara, how good a job do cities with common interests on some of these issues do? How good a job do they do of collaborating and bolstering and supporting and filing front of the court briefs and standing up for each other?
We've gotten to know the law directors throughout the state precisely because of home rule. We usually have many conversations, and we talk about the types of claims we think there are. I mean, most recently, the small cell bill, this was in 2017, the state passed a law saying that, and they put it in their budget, or I'm sorry, it wasn't the budget bill, it was the puppy mill bill. And so as part of the puppy mill bill, they said that there was a limit on local authority for the placement of micro wireless equipment in the right-of-way. And cities couldn't prevent further regulations. And then they went on to say that people could put these microcells on street signs, on traffic poles, on street lights, the city's property. And so we found this pretty repugnant, and so did most of the states throughout, most of the cities, I'm sorry, throughout the state of Ohio. And we had many conversations with our partners at those cities, and we all decided to file separate claims rather than consolidating into one. And so the result is we've got 2 courts that have struck it down. Now, they didn't strike it down based on home rule. They struck it down based on the Constitution requires that bills in the legislature address a single subject. And this had puppy mills, bestiality.
Bestiality.
Yes.
Who's going to vote for bestiality?
I know. Small cells, minimum wage. It threw in a whole bunch of things. And so 2 courts now have struck down the small cell, saying it was repugnant to the single subject rule. However, a court in Youngstown, Akron, upheld it. They said that the single subject rule was not violated. We have not gotten a decision from our court on this yet. Our briefs are still pending.
Mayor Summers, how upsetting do you find this we can put our hardware anywhere we want it legislation? I mean, what are the implications of that for a city like Lakewood that does a lot to preserve its neighborhoods and the character of its community?
Actually, that particular example is a very good one for Lakewood. Those of you who know Lakewood well know there's a whole lot of things going on in a very small amount of space. And anything that's put as an obstacle or a structure anywhere in our city takes a lot of thought, no matter whether it's private or public. So in this particular example, the city of Lakewood has continued to fight with other cities to preserve the ability to manage this infrastructure where it goes. We can generally work it out, but we have to be thoughtful about it. We can find little corners here and there, and we are working with success with AT&T, who's running a fiber to the house strategy throughout Lakewood. You've seen all the fiber trucks, but it's taken a lot of pushing and shoving for us to get them to agree. And fortunately, they're willing to work with us, but they don't have to at this point while we contest this right. It's a very important issue. And for anybody who's backed out of a driveway in Lakewood, if you know that the AT&T could put a huge box on your tree lawn that could obstruct your view and your neighbor's view, that's a serious issue.
Tom, would this be an example of, I think, what in one of your columns you referred to as a ripper bill? In other words, a preemptive strike? In other words, that having the legislature put together.
For a second, I'm sorry.
You had a column, I think, when you were talking about the traffic camera decision, and you referenced in there
Yes.
ripper bills. And I'm just saying, would this qualify as one where special interests got together to write a preemptive bill to prohibit cities from
Yes.
regulating? I mean, do you know the background of
Yes,
this?
I do.
Basically, it was
Also-
AT&T that wrote this, right?
Although I have to declare an interest, I personally dislike intensely traffic cameras. I'm just not going to say more than that, but I don't
Okay.
like them. But as a driver and a person, but yes, they did. And
Drive the speed limit, and they're not a problem.
the appeal process of the city of Cleveland is not exactly whatever, but let's leave it at that. But I do, and it's a matter of, sometimes what happens in Columbus is someone has a client. It could be even a good cause. The Sisters of Sisters of Charity. Or someone has a client who has a product. They want to make it used in Ohio, and so someone comes in and says, "Hey, let's have traffic cameras. I happen to know someone who sells them." I don't mean it's anything illicit because you still have to buy from different vendors, but this is how a lot of things happen, and this is one of those things in those cases where it started off, and it is believed widely that some of the legislators who oppose cities having the right to use traffic and speed cameras don't like them because they themselves got dinged because through cameras in other jurisdictions. And so it's become a personal thing. It's some kind of a toll gate, not really a traffic law violation or something like that. But I want to mention one other thing that may affect the mayor, that's going to affect everybody in this room, and maybe the city of Cleveland, is the legislature is now trying, in effect, to interfere in how cities collect income tax, municipal income tax. And I would agree, having lived up here for the first part of my time with Cleveland.com and the Plain Dealer, that there are an amazing number of jurisdictions in this county have very widely varying ordinances on income tax, but I found it can be worked out okay. But the governor and his administration and his legislature currently, if they had their way, well, they're not going to have it right now. We'll be centralizing all collection in Columbus and then charging a service charge to Lakewood and to Cleveland for doing you the great favor of collecting money for you, even though you don't want to have them do it for you. Another example is someone that just thinks it's a great idea to do that because probably someone has software that can handle it or something like that. I mean, speculating about that. On the red light camera thing and the speed camera thing, as I said, personally, I kind of have a dog in the fight, I suppose, or I did maybe. The dog didn't live very long, so to speak. But it's what I find startling is the fact, it does seem to me, and I've gone to a lot of city councils. Part of my teaching is going to a city council in Athens, Ohio, which is like an ADA meeting sometimes. That's another story. But I do think that local officials are in the best position to make those decisions. Because, I mean, how can someone in Columbus decide whether at the intersection of Nicholson and Detroit or something, what's the best thing to do about traffic or how to handle speeders or how to handle whatever it happens to be? They can't. There's no way they can. That was what Baker and others objected to, trying to use a one-size-fits-all plan to a very, very diverse state in every way. And this was an example of that. And now they're going after it again because the courts ruled, in fact, you can use traffic cameras and so forth.
The Supreme Court
And so
ruled
now-
in favor of
Right, they won't take no for an answer in the Ohio Senate, except on some things they will, but not on that. And they're going back to, and just as an opinion writer, I would say there's so many more important things for our legislature to deal with that haven't been dealt with than trying to tell cities and villages how to run their local traffic laws, it seems to me. But that's me. But they know that it's popular to be seen as someone who opposes these things.
Right. But I mean, the political irony is many of these are the same people who resent it when the federal government comes in
Right.
and looks over their shoulder and wants to regulate and dictate the do's and don'ts. And yet they don't seem to see the inconsistency
Right.
or hypocrisy of that.
Well, another example, and for people in this field probably care about, I do personally, about humane laws. Ohio's humane laws are very, very weak, and it's a disgraceful situation. And the city of Grove City, the Columbus suburb, wanted to regulate pet shops to make sure they weren't really selling puppies and from puppy mills. And someone went around that and got the legislature to preempt cities and villages regulating that. Now, it seems to me that's an extreme case. The lobbying client was one of the big pet store chains, which they have a right, First Amendment right to do that, to go and ask for a change. But it was so blatant that it's just telling cities that their residents really think strongly and clearly about humane treatment of companion animals. Well, we'll decide for you in Columbus. You aren't qualified to make that decision in Grove City or any place else. And that's part of it. And this could be either party, by the way. I don't know that on the gun law thing, it partly was some Democrats wanted to be, not to get the NRA mad at them or something, but it's an arrogance fundamentally to say that although you are sovereigns as voters, you're only sovereigns part of the way. And it seems to me you're either a sovereign or you're not. You can't be like partly a sovereign of your local affairs. But that's an example of it.
All right. Mayor Summers, I know you've been very instrumental and played a key role in forming this new group of mayors of Ohio cities, a bipartisan group trying to protect and assert and maybe get back some of these eroded home rule powers. Could you tell us a little bit about the group and what their game plan and strategy is and how it's working so far?
Tom's referring to the Ohio's Mayor's Alliance. It's a group of the biggest 30 cities in Ohio. Lakewood is actually number 15 on that list. There are 6 other cities in Northeast Ohio that are on that list. And the idea is that as bigger cities in particular, we are able to articulate a complexity of urban need much more effectively by working together. About half those 30 cities are Republican-led mayors, half are Democrat. The issues we're talking about, such as control of income tax collection and its effectiveness, is absolutely a nonpartisan question.
Yeah.
It gets to the lifeblood of how we fund Ohio's cities, and the control of that is very threatening, and we're determined to work together to overcome what is classically a rural versus urban conflict here in Ohio. The rural wins in terms of number of seats. Tom Suddes referenced that. And the caucus, which is how policy is made, so the Democratic caucus meets, creates their agenda. Guess who's not in that room? Most of the votes. And when the Republican caucus meets, guess who's not in that room? The cities. So the fact of the matter is the policies that emanate from the caucuses, which drive sort of the agenda for the legislature, are missing the key element of what is important to cities like the Big 30. So we're working hard to try and get that message understood better.
So are you getting the level of participation you want? Barbara, do you know, is Mayor Jackson active in this group?
He's a member, but not active.
Okay.
We could use Cleveland a little
Maybe
bit
there's
more.
maybe there's a message to take back there, perhaps. Mayor, describe what would be the impact if the state is permitted to collect income taxes from business. I mean, would you actually lose money, or is it just you'd get it late? How would it hurt the city of Lakewood and others?
And we fought vigorously in this budget bill, and frankly lost to a certain degree. We drew a neutral draw on the fact that the state now creates an option for a business filer, net profit, not your W-2 income filer, which is most of us individually. They can choose to file locally or at the state level. That was actually a victory for us because previous entries of that bill required them to file at the state level. The problem is that in most of the businesses in the state of Ohio are small businesses. And most of them, frankly, need some help in filing municipal income tax. Here in Lakewood, we're a self-collector. We offer an enormous amount of service to all our taxpayers, and they value that. If we lose control of that, we lose, one, the help to the taxpayer, and the second thing we lose, more importantly, to Lakewood is who cares most about who pays income tax in Lakewood? Lakewood. And in a city like ours, with 1/3 of our population churning every year because of the rental implications, no one's going to care but us in terms of who owes that tax. So we're highly motivated, and we're reasonably effective at it. We work hard at it. We actually share some services with the city of Cleveland to help us do that. It's an important strategy, but state of Ohio bureaucracy down in Columbus could care less as to who lives in Lakewood. But obviously, we stand to lose a great deal of how we would fund our government. So the point is, the inspiration, the motivation, and the focus, and the creative solutions come from this local connection. That would
So
absolutely be
who is
lost.
championing this idea the most? I mean, I know Governor Kasich was in favor of it very much, is
Very
in
much
favor
in
of it.
favor.
But I mean, are there
It's a big business
Are there
deal.
business advocacy groups, Chamber of Commerce type groups that are?
And disappointingly, there were two major powers at play here. The Ohio Association of CPAs, the tax preparers, didn't want to do the work of multiple jurisdiction filing if there were differences. We've worked hard actually as cities to simplify and homogenize our ability to make that simpler anyway. We've had some good success there. That was one group. Then the other big group are big businesses who have multi-jurisdiction locations. And I have to tell you, when in my previous life as a business owner, Summers Rubber Company had 7 business locations in Ohio. We filed in 7 different counties, 7 different cities, and also one in Western Pennsylvania. I never felt that the local jurisdiction complication was a hindrance to how we went about business. There were lots of challenges to our business model. That was never one of them. So I always viewed that as a red herring in terms of a very, very minor obstacle. But there's this general sense out there of a Wall Street view of big is better, economics of scale drive production, elimination of local regulations makes it more efficient and competitive, and if you want to win jobs in Ohio, you're going to favor the big business view of it. That's the power that's at play here, and there's a lot of that could be lost, and frankly, I'm not sure big business is going to come anyway. I think workforce issues or other much more compelling competitive questions that are before us than this particular regulation.
Okay, and big compelling questions, which is my segue to the way too long quiet Tom Bier here.
That's probably a good thing.
Okay, well, all of that pent-up wisdom is about to explode now. You approach home rule in a different way, I know, in your ebook. You talk about the state, the cities have lost both significant funding and the ability to implement and carry out their home rule powers with the out-migration of jobs and property tax value and residents to the outlying suburbs. So I'm just trying to get your take on how home rule fits into all this equation and whether it's part of the problem or part of the answer.
It's both, I suppose. Technically the technicality of home rule is not what I'm going to speak about. My history has been housing, and really the kind of the rise and fall of communities in Northeast Ohio. And by rise and fall, I mean up the road we have Avon rising. And then a little south of that, we have North Ridgeville rising, and then we've got Brunswick rising, and then we have Aurora rising, and we got a lot of rising out there. And what we have back here is Lakewood, the second oldest suburb in the county. The oldest is East Cleveland, actually, but Lakewood's not far behind in age. And in a couple of years, over half the homes in Lakewood will be over 100 years old. That's pretty significant. And not that Lakewood is falling, but I think, Mayor, I can say that it's a tough go.
You bet.
That being the mayor of Lakewood is a very different animal than being the mayor of Avon. Because in Avon out there, it's contending with growth, managing it. And every day, every time, every new business comes in, it's new taxes, more taxes, revenues. Housing, more revenues. Yes, more kids to go to school and so forth. So the school, everything's growth. Here, it's struggle. And I happen to live in Cleveland Heights, which is the third oldest suburb, and then Shaker is the fourth. I can say without question that it is struggle in Cleveland Heights. Shaker is a little more affluent, a little better tax base, but I think Mayor Lycan would say it too is struggle. It's no fun becoming an old community. And it took some decades for suburbs to get to this point, but they've arrived. The original struggle was in the city of Cleveland. That's where the old was. But then it began to hit roughly 30, 40 years ago it began. And now it is struggle. Now, where does home rule fit into this? And I came at it, or met up with home rule sort of through the side door. I wasn't looking for home rule. I was looking for the answer to the question. Why is there so much construction and development in the outer suburbs and so little in the city of Cleveland compared with what's going on in the outer suburbs in the adjacent counties? And why is it so difficult to redevelop in Lakewood, in Cleveland Heights, in Shaker Heights, in Euclid, in Parma? It is difficult to do it, but it's booming out there. And that led me to home rule. Because what home rule has come to mean is, Lakewood, you govern yourself. All of your problems are yours. I happen to live in Cleveland Heights. Lakewood's problems mean nothing to me. I have no responsibility, no obligation, nothing. I don't live in the city of Cleveland. Your problems are your problems. Good luck. And if I live way out in Avon, not that I'm denigrating anybody who's there, I moved out here to get away from that. And all of that crap in there has nothing to do with me. And the state, where is the state? City of Cleveland, City of Lakewood, City of Cleveland Heights, you are all governing yourselves. We in the state have nothing to do really with your problems, basically. That's how it works. Meanwhile, the state is very happy to build I-90 in the first place, put a new interchange in Avon, widen I-271 as it's doing today, which makes it easier for all of those places to grow. And as they grow, they are pulling economic strength out with them. And as Mayor Summers loses his economic strength gradually, he has to fight like hell to figure out, how am I going to get some new strength? That's the issue. And by considering old communities, which the state does, by considering old communities to be solely responsible for their condition, the state uses home rule to evade its constitutional responsibility. Not necessarily willfully, but that's the way the game is played. And the Constitution states, all political power is inherent in the people. good news. Government is instituted for their equal protection and benefit, and no special privileges or immunities shall ever be granted. But wait a minute. By making it easy for a farmer in Avon to sell the farm for maybe $200,000 an acre, and if it were zoned in commercial or industrial, it might be $50,000 an acre. Taking residents or enticing, making it easy for residents to move from Lakewood, from Fairview Park, from Cleveland, from Rocky River, to go out there. And by the way, to get away from the higher taxes, which have to be levied back here because they can't grow their tax base, you have to elevate the tax rate. So the state invites that. It rewards a benefit to the farmers out there. Meanwhile, what is happening to the value of real estate in the city of Cleveland, in Lakewood, in Fairview Park? That value is being eroded. And what the state is doing is enabling the shifting of property value. It is taking property value from in here and giving it to farmers out there. In my book, that is a very particular special benefit. And it all stems, as I see it, from the fact that home rule, in principle, makes every jurisdiction independent on your own. So whatever messes you have in the city of Cleveland, they're all yours. Nobody else, including the state, will admit to any responsibility for that at all. And that's the fundamental underlying issue that is really creating distresses in some parts of this region and joy in others, depending on where you stand and live.
So, turning the page, your proposal or your suggestion for a way to stop this trend from getting to the alarming conclusion, which I think you have some very dramatic numbers about what the impact on the taxpayer is going to be in a relatively short period of time.
Well, we're shifting tax base out
Right,
there.
right.
We're weakening the tax. That's what's happening. The tax base in here is really weakening. And for those of us who remain in here, if Mayor Summers is going to have a prayer of a chance of advancing in what he wants to do in the city, in the council, he has to raise the taxes. That's what you have to do. Then what? I mean, Shaker just raised its income tax a quarter. Cleveland Heights raised it. Did Euclid do, I think, as well? It is do-it-yourself survival. And the more survival that is happening, and people who have choice about where they can live begin to sense, it's an eroding situation. Get out. With some detachment, any thoughtful person, looking at all of this economically, would say the last place you want to be in this region is in the city of Cleveland and in the inner suburbs. Get out. Get out where security and safety is. So we have a collapsing core, basically. Now,
So what is your suggestion? A more regional wealth sharing plan?
well, it comes down to economics. Mayor Summers doesn't have the resources to accomplish what needs to be done here. City of Cleveland obviously doesn't. Shaker is the best positioned suburb, but even there, I think Mayor Lycan would probably say, we could use more resources. So it comes down to money. But the way it is now, of course, the way the game is played, that every place is considered, you're on your own, you have to survive in your own resources. So that's what has to change, and it can change. And how can it change? Well, in my view, we can do what has been underway in Minneapolis, St. Paul for over 45 years. We can share in the growth of taxes. They do it, involving 7 counties and about 150 independent cities, villages, and townships. Independent. They have they're very independent. They have their home rule, but they share in the growth of taxes. If we had that here, and in my view, it really is the core of the solution. If we had it here, then Avon, as it's growing, would keep most of its growth, taxes, increased revenues. It would keep most of it. But a portion of it, say 10%, would go into a kitty. And the kitty, and then every place that is in the region, and most of the growth now is outside of Cuyahoga County. Every place that's growing, a portion of its growth, each year, growth in its tax base, would go into a kitty and be redistributed to the places that need redevelopment and renewal. And I think the rationale for that is this. The reason Avon is growing is because it happens to be very close to Cuyahoga County. And if Avon was out in the middle of Noble County, largely rural, it would be a sleepy little pleasant village. The only reason that Avon is growing is because of the economic strength that is in the region, most of which is in Cuyahoga County. So it's the successes that it is enjoying and the successes that the mayor and council there are celebrating. All of that virtually is a result of its proximity to Cuyahoga County. Since Cuyahoga County is producing that growth, I would say legitimately, the older communities in this county, Lakewood being one of the major ones, have a claim on a small portion of what is being produced out there. That's basically how Minneapolis-St. Paul operates. And if you look at the differences between Minneapolis-St. Paul and the Cleveland-Akron region over the last, say, 30, 40 years, economic differences in terms of the average income in this region today is around $51,000. Up there, it is $71,000. That's the average, $71,000 in a region that's about the same size as this one. The job growth, they've gained 800,000 jobs in 40 years. We've gained 200,000. If tax growth sharing is hurting them, I can't see it in the numbers. Now, politically, it is probably the most challenging initiative one could imagine undertaking. Because there's no way in hell that Avon is going to celebrate the proposal that they start sharing some of their growth. I'm not castigating them, but neither is North Ridgeville or Brunswick or Hudson or Mentor. But the reality is, as a region, we're doing much less well than we could. And I think tax sharing is one of the routes to a better future.
I told you it'd be worth waiting for. Mayor, do you agree with the picture that he's painted? Question number one. And question number two, when the Mayors and Managers Association convenes and gets together, are there any conversations that sound like this at all?
There's 3 levels of cooperation. There's collaboration, which happens all day long in the region. Mayors helping mayors deal with issues. There's shared service, which is happening increasingly, where we help each other in a formal way on equipment, talent, and capacity. The last one is regional government. That conversation is not happening. So perhaps we're inching towards it. But there's a greater recognition, particularly of the Inner Ring, by the way, which is an organized group of 17 cities that are meeting this Thursday. We meet quarterly to share and explore how we can confront these challenges that I do agree Tom articulates very well, but not regional government yet.
Tom, a quick, for those who might want to read your ebook, can you lead them, connect the dots for them? Where can they find it? It's on Cleveland State's website.
If you Google Cleveland State, Tom Bier, and the title of the book is Housing Dynamics in Northeast Ohio. So if you Google Cleveland State, Tom Bier, housing, you'll get it. And well, if you download it, there's no charge. But you can also purchase a hard copy.
All right. Ching. So, Barbara, are there any other cases pending that we failed to touch on? What's the Fannie Lewis law, the hiring for public projects? What's the status of that?
That, the city of Cleveland passed a law in 2003 where, and we see this as a power of local self-government, where we said if you enter into a contract with us to perform any kind of work, primarily construction work, that one or more city residents must perform 20% of the total construction worker hours performed on any construction contract where the city spends more than $100,000 of its own money. And then we also have a requirement that 4% of the construction worker hours are low-income people, and we identify what those are. And we saw this as a power of local self-government. We saw this as people we do business with, these are the things that we want from them when they do business with us. The state turned around and passed a law solely to prohibit a law like that, where they said no public authority shall require a contractor as part of a pre-qualification process or for the construction of a public improvement or the design of professional services to design that improvement, deploy as laborers a certain number or percentage of individuals who reside within the defined geographic area. They also said we couldn't give a preference to contractors who promised to hire people from our local geographic area. They had no other regulations. And so we challenged the state law, and the our trial court, actually Gary's handling the case, but we are now on appeal actually to the 8th District on it, and what the state is arguing is not that it's a matter of local self-government, but they're pulling out the health, safety, and welfare of employees. And they're saying this is just like a residency law. This is just like requiring people to live in the city, and for their health, safety, and welfare, you can't do that. So they're relying on that other constitutional provision that's seen as a higher power over home rule. And Gary's got the oral argument next week on that. Was it Monday? Monday?
No, it's Wednesday.
Wednesday.
It was Tuesday, but we're not in Belgium, so they moved it to Wednesday because one of the judges couldn't be there. Following up on what Barbara said, I just want to be clear that the trial court ruled in our favor. We're the appellee, which means it's the state that's taken this case up on appeal. They are making two arguments. One is health and welfare of employees under Article 2, Section 34 of the Constitution. But the trial court judge, Michael Russo, is the judge who actually handled this case. He found that 234 was not implicated here because this is a contract between contractors and the city. There's no pre-existing limit on who the contractor hires or doesn't hire. It's just that when you enter a contract with the city, if you don't meet the requirements of the 20% labor charge that you've agreed to at taking the contract, that you're going to work to do that, then there is some relatively minor contractual terms that deal with what you would owe the city as a more or less a penalty of sorts, I guess. But I think it's no more than 3% of the contract. But again, these contractors come into the contracts with their eyes open. They know what Cleveland's requirements are. They agree to contract with us knowing full well that the Fannie Lewis law, and it's named after a former councilwoman who was very active in this area, they know what they're dealing with the city of Cleveland. So the Ohio Contractors Association, I believe, is probably behind this particular, again, trying to take away our home rule, because contracts have been historically viewed not as a police power, but as local self-government home rule issues. So the state, once again, is trying to insert itself. And you know, just one point on this, which is sort of funny, I guess, but maybe 5 years ago, or thereabouts. It could have been a couple years more. The state actually adopted 2 revised code provisions. Now, this was the same General Assembly that's been Republican dominated by the agrarian rural folks for a number of years. But back less than 10 years ago, I would say, they adopted 2 statutes. And what those statutes said was that any contract that a local community has, if it involves state money or the city is putting up at least $100,000 towards the contract, that the state law recognized any local community's laws. Now, these are the contracts that would go to ODOT, or the contracts that would go in the more general state construction aspect, Chapter 153 or Chapter 5525 of the revised code. The state actually, in effect, adopted the city of Cleveland's Fannie Lewis law by saying that law would apply with regards to state contracts when they enter into our area if the city is putting up some of the money. Those 2 revised code provisions were repealed by, again, I mentioned Chapter 9 of the revised code earlier. Again, this law that says cities, you can't do this anymore, comes out of Chapter 9, and it's called 9.49. There's a trend here. 9.68 was the firearms prohibition on cities. 9.481 was the prohibition on residency requirements. Chapter 9 is not a favorite of cities right now with regards to its use to come up with these laws that try to take away long-standing. I mean, our ability to contract's always been recognized as local self-government, and for the state to come in now and say, just as a prohibition, you know, one thing I don't know if we said or not, just quickly what a general law is that we can't be in conflict with. That's a law that's a comprehensive enactment that applies to all parts of the state uniformly, and it involves police, sanitary regulations, those kind of laws. Or, and finally, it has to meet a 4th test, which it's a rule of conduct. It regulates conduct of citizens in general. So these laws that just prohibit cities are not general laws as we see it. And this particular law is not even part of a comprehensive enactment like the firearms law might be, because as Barbara indicated, there is no other set of laws that this thing dovetails into. It's strictly an attempt. And I might add that this law came into existence within a year or so after the Ohio Contractors Association had challenged a similar law that Akron has with regards to a certain percentage of Akron not employees, but citizens being involved in this. There's a massive reconstruction project in Akron dealing with land drainage issues. So they tried a federal cause of action against Akron, and the federal court kicked them out. And so shortly after they weren't able to prevail in federal court against the Akron law, all of a sudden the State General Assembly passes this 9.49 law. I don't think we were even in the crosshairs on that one. I think it was sort of a dragnet. Every city that has a law like this now gets dragnetted into this prohibition on their authority. And we are fighting it, and we don't think it has anything to do with 234. Any argument that it's similar to a residency law is just nonsense, because we don't have any requirements on who you hire, where they live, or anything like that. All we say is, here's the terms, take them or leave them, but if you take them, then 20% of the construction work is going to be performed by Cleveland residents, or you're going to pay a minor penalty on the total contract cost. And so we did win in the trial court. Our oral argument is next Wednesday at 10 a.m. It's in front of a 3-judge panel. The issue is home rule, and similar to the residency case, the state is going to stand up there and argue it's a 234, which means that law, health and welfare of employees, takes precedence over everything. The trial judge rejected that argument. We'll see what the 8th District does. But certainly, we'll go up there and give it our best argument. And whichever side wins or loses, I'm sure this case will make its way to the Ohio Supreme Court. Usually, if the state loses one of these cases, the Supreme Court will automatically take it in. If a city wins on one, it's not so clear. I think Tom early on had mentioned the word trans fat. Again, a lobbying group tried to pass or got the General Assembly, and this is all documented, this isn't my speculation. We found this out in discovery during the case, that a lobby group in the budget bill 4 years ago, I guess now, they included a provision there that made the director of Department of Agriculture, he would be in charge of determining what's healthy food or not, and whether you can have, food desert, or what they call deserts, where, especially in the poor areas where they don't have access to fresh foods and stuff. Well, all that was now going to be under the director of Department of Agriculture. What our trans fat law that was enacted by City Council did was said, not on prepackaged stuff, anything that comes into our city, in a package or something, we didn't take control over that. What we said was, if you have a menu item and you're making it for somebody, or you're packaging it like a deli or something like that, you can't use trans fats. And I don't think it was an immediate ban. It was sort of factored.
2 years.
2 years. And so the state, and it's the budget bill, the appropriations bill for the state, included this little obscure provision that in effect gutted, I'll use the word, with regards to our ability to ban trans fats. And again, not on commercial trans fats coming in and packaged breads and all that kind of stuff, but on what you're putting into a locally made product. And so we did challenge them. We won in the trial court. We won on the 8th District. And the state, for whatever reason, did not appeal that case. So that's another win for the city on a home rule issue.
Is the situation in Ohio much different than in any other states? Are cities in other states under siege just as much as communities are in Ohio?
I went to a conference in May organized by Fordham Law School in New York City, and they gathered law directors from around the country. And I had never really paid any attention to the home rule provisions in other states because it didn't affect us. I mean, we're focused on our Constitution and how it affects us as a city. And it was interesting to hear from these other states because this is a common problem throughout the country where the legislatures have really clamped down on cities' abilities to govern themselves. Now, the states have all kinds of each state has different kinds of home rule powers. We actually have what we used to think were generous home rule powers. And some states don't have quite as generous home rule powers as we do. But in some states, it's really draconian. There's one state where they don't have a local income tax. They're funded through the state. And the state actually passed a law saying that if you pass a law that our Attorney General determines on his own without a court proceeding to be in violation of a prohibition we have, we get to withhold some of your funds. So they are really taking some strong measures to try to keep cities in line. And, as the mayor knows, cutting off your revenue source is a sure way to harm a city.
Right.
And so it does seem to be a real problem throughout the country.
There is a movement on that. In fact, the Fordham group actually filed a friend of the court brief in our appeal case that is being heard
The
next
Fannie Lewis
Wednesday.
case. Yeah, they, along with the International Municipal Lawyers Association, it's international by virtue of the fact it includes municipalities in this country and Canada. And they filed a friend of the court brief as well, because it is a concern throughout the
So it's
country.
widespread.
Yes. Yes.
Now some questions from the folks who have been sitting patiently listening for all this time. What authorities do counties have over cities? Is there a home rule power issue of counties versus cities? Do counties have their own home rule powers?
I can answer the last question first. Counties do, counties like ours, where they have a county executive, in the Cuyahoga County's charter, it does give them home rule powers, and they have their own home rule powers. Their power vis-a-vis us, we're still separate. They have no control over us, even though we are a part of Cuyahoga County. They don't control us. Now, it hasn't all played out. They've only been in existence, a relatively young form of government. So we don't know if we'll bump up against them.
So is there a state versus county home rule issue? I'm thinking just of the issue that came to light this week about the possibility of charging for bags at the grocery store. I'm wondering if that might not be something that, certain industry groups might not want to fight statewide, perhaps?
Yeah, it may. It may. They may have to fight the state on it, yes. They do. I mean, the county does have its ability to make laws governing itself and police regulations, and so they would bump up against the state like we do.
I think the county's powers of home rule are somewhat more limited than the city because we have a specific constitutional provision that lays out that we have local self-governing authority that has been interpreted over the years. And I think Barbara's right that the counties are trying to increase their local authority by the form of government they adopt. But historically, it's been municipal home rule in Cleveland with counties and villages townships being more or less controlled by state law statutes.
Questioner asking maybe if the city of Cleveland hasn't been guilty of being a tad inconsistent here, contrasting all of the home rule issues that the city has tried to preserve, but then its approach to the individual city minimum wage law, where they actually, I believe, went down and pushed hard for the legislature to do something to keep individual cities from having their own city by city minimum wages. I mean, how do you reconcile that?
I actually believe that it would be hard to sustain an individual minimum wage law in a city, and that's because of this provision we've talked about a lot that was used against us in the residency case, where the Constitution says laws may be passed fixing and regulating hours of labor, establishing a minimum wage, and providing for the comfort, health, safety, and welfare of employees, and no other provision of the Constitution shall impair or limit its power. And that would be used against us if we were to establish a minimum wage. Now, there's another separate constitutional provision that addresses minimum wage, and it has some odd language at the end. But when that was passed, it didn't in any way restrict this particular provision.
The only thing I would add to that is the city, it's not just an automatic whatever the state does, we're against. I mean, in the minimum wage thing, we do recognize that there are general laws that we can't conflict with. And we think that a minimum wage law in this regard, or there is a minimum wage constitutional provision right now that, and the state sets a statewide minimum wage law.
Going up to $8.30 next year, I think, $8.30 an hour.
But, it gets into a separate argument, which is if Cleveland alone has a $15 minimum wage, what does that do to Cleveland's ability to compete with the Avons or whoever else might be paying their people $8.95 or whatever, their particular minimum wages? It's an economic theory. I mean, you can buy it or not. Some people don't. Obviously, it was a pretty contentious issue in Cleveland with a lot of legal ramifications over the last few months. But it's just one of those issues that the city does recognize that the state does have the authority to have general laws that we're not allowed to conflict with, and we happen to think that the minimum wage law might be one of those.
What can the individual citizen who is concerned about his home community losing home rule powers, what could they do? And is there possibly any statewide voting issue that could strengthen or restore home rules if there were a statewide vote?
I'm going to jump in on this one because I've thought about this a lot. I'm not going to ask anybody to raise his or her hand in this room, but one of the only ways you can be current with this is to attend meetings of your city council, your village council, and to attend meetings of your school board. Now, your school board is a different topic. I realize that. It is interesting to me how few people actually go to these meetings and see what's going on. I'm not saying anything sinister is going on. You can't possibly, though, catch all that's going on unless you're actually there and get used to how procedure is followed and what's in the ordinances and so forth. No news copy, which by its very nature is compressed, can do it justice. I've learned by taking my one class to a city council, as I said, I'm part of the curriculum, that I've learned that you really can't, unless you actually go and watch what's going on, you can't do a thing about it. And you can't be aware of the perils that your local home rule has unless your local officials, and they will, make you aware of it. Number two, I would suggest to you, if you have the opportunity, and many of you are very busy, I realize that, although it's not a super informative website in that it is not really interactive, look at the municipal league's website. It has lots of memos and action information on current legislative bills that impinge on home rule. You're paying dues as a citizen of, I'm sure you belong to a municipal league, right? You're paying dues to the municipal league anyway. It's not a private service anyway, but most every city and village in the state belongs to it. It goes back almost 100 years. It's respected on both sides of the aisle because many, many cities are Republican. I'd say that too. And the third thing is that with all due respect to members of the bar, always keep in mind that when people impinge on home rule, although it can be adjudicated later in terms of constitutional legal principles, the first question to ask about any home rule thing is, who benefits? There's some lobby behind every change in home rule that happens in this state, at least in the last 20 years or so. It couldn't be even a benign, it could be Mother Teresa, I don't know. You have to see who it is. That's the story. The politics is the story. The law stuff comes later to remedy the politics if they go out of hand and it's impinge on things. And finally, I would say again, you have some, in my opinion as an opinion writer, you have some pretty legislators in this part of the state, including Lakewood specifically, over the years. But I think you should get to know your legislators really well and keep in touch with them and see what's going on with them and check their websites when they post things occasionally about issues, because they're on the front lines. And sometimes what happens in Columbus, if no one pays attention, so someone says, well, there's no controversy over this, no one cares about this. And so they say, well, I'd rather say yes than no. It's always easier in life to do that. I'll just vote for it because no one's complained to me about this and warned me about it. I mean, no ordinary voter has. So I'd say being an informed voter is your first responsibility to yourself, and it sounds didactic, and to your community. And finally, I would say the legislature is actually more online than ever in a way. The Legislative Service Commissions, which is the drafting agency, has analytics on their website for every bill and has fiscal notes for every bill. And although it's written with all due respect to members of the bar, and they use sometimes a little bit too much legalese, it explains very clearly what a bill would do. I've never known them to get it wrong or never known them to skew what they write. They're almost like robots in the best sense of the word, very down the middle. So the resources are there for you to find out about this, but you have to do a little bit of work on it, I'm afraid. You really do. That's one good solution.
As a former Legislative Service Commission employee, I don't know about the robot part, but they do a pretty good job.
The lawyers are our protectors of all our rights. I'm not criticizing that in the least. I'm just saying that, no, but part of it is, in fact, you have to understand the legislature is an arena in which real interest joust, not philosophy. They may talk philosophy.
All right.
That's what,
All right, the final crystal ball gazing question. Which local home rule power will be contested next?
Well, we have two going on.
Visionaries.
I think the tax stuff is
I mean,
probably next up.
I agree.
Yeah. Because I don't think they're gonna stop where they were. And to add to what the mayor had said earlier, the other important thing about the taxes, right now we get to collect it, so we get the cash flow. It goes to the state. Who knows when they give it to us? Who knows how much of it they take out of it before they give it to us. And so there's a real direct effect on our cash flow as well. But I think that's the next big fight.
And just real quickly on that, sort of synthesizing everything here, one of the big revolutions that I think is sort of driving some of the local home rule fights is communication. You know, if you think about it, back in the 1912 era when home rule came into effect, communications, I mean, Cleveland and Columbus were far apart, Cincinnati further apart. And this is an argument that was made during one of our fights over home rule. The state sort of takes the position that everyone knows everything now. And so a more centralized view of how everyone interacts within the state, that seems to be guiding part of this process to take away home rule, or I won't say take away, but passing laws that we believe restrict our home rule. And so that's not for me to, I mean, that's more for an academic to think about, but the idea of instantaneous communication, the fact that the central government knows everything that's going on almost as quick as we do, drives this accumulation of wanting to have authority over everything that's done because they know it. Of course, we disagree, and we believe in the local patchwork of local laws.
Well, I'm inspired to go home and start reasserting some of my home rule rights. By gosh. Could we have a round of applause for our panel and their wisdom and insights? And thank you all for your attention and thoughtful questions. I just want to say the next get-together like this will be Thursday, November 6th. A look at the political crystal ball for 2018, moderated by Cleveland.com's political wise man, Andrew Tobias. That will be at the Parma Snow Branch of the Cuyahoga County Library. That will begin, I believe, at 7 o'clock. So thank you all for being here, and have a good night.